Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Missing Pet Consultant Certificate course. This is Course 2, Missing Pet Prevention and Recovery in the Animal Shelter, Module B, Barriers to Owner Reunion. This is something that I learned about back in 2014. I conducted a study of all the animal shelters in Northern California where I live because I wanted to learn why some have significantly higher reclaim rates than others. Most are pretty low. They're within the national average of 20% for dogs and 2% for cats. But there were some that seemed to be doing a lot better, and I wanted to find out why. So I conducted a study on all the animal shelters in my area, and I was able to identify a number of barriers. So we're going to touch on those in the class today and talk about some other things that you can do to help improve your reclaim rates by removing those barriers. So first I want to talk a little bit about shelter culture. And there's going to be a culture in any kind of workplace. And it's going to have involving many factors: the people who work there, the leadership, the expectations, whether it's a government department or a nonprofit, the history of sheltering in general, as we've touched on, and the history of that particular organization, why they were started, where they're going, what the mission is. There's so many things. But a lot of it just comes down to people. People and attitudes have an amazing effect on what you do from day to day and how effective is your work. So one of the things that I hear a lot, and I never want to see or hear any of you say this, whether at the shelter or any time in your life, that's the way we've always done it. This is really a non-productive statement that I used to work with a woman who would just shake her head every time someone said this. This was in a different county department, but it was the same for her, that when she would ask someone why they were doing something that was wrong or unhelpful, they would say, well, that's the way we've always done it, as if that were a reason for taking the action. But unfortunately, you will see this in a lot of shelters and other kinds of workplaces, where there will be practices that really aren't helpful or don't kind of make sense, or overly complicated procedures and policies, and nobody seems to remember why. Or there may be some story about why it was done that way, or because they're concerned that something may happen. But you really need to examine everything in order to be successful. And there's nothing wrong with taking apart procedures that aren't helpful, or just reviewing all your procedures, whether they seem to be working or not, and saying, can we do this better? This would certainly be done in a for-profit business. You know, can we sell more products? Can we promote more services? Can we get more customers? But we don't often think about these things in sheltering. We just kind of truck along the way we've always done it. Blaming the public. This is something we talked about in the last module, and this is another huge part of shelter culture. Now, when I started in animal sheltering in the late 80s, early 90s, I was in on this just as much as the next person. We were taught at the time, that was our culture, that all these terrible things that happen in animal shelters, all the euthanasia, all the stray animals, was because of the public, because people didn't care, they didn't spay or neuter, they weren't looking for their missing pets, and all of these other things that really aren't true. Now, that's not to say that people aren't neglectful of their pets. They certainly are, but those folks are in the vast minority. And the bottom line is that this kind of attitude isn't helpful, because if we spend our energy doing anything that isn't helpful, we all only have so much energy and time for each day. And the organization only has so many resources. So if we're spending our energy unproductively, then we are not going to get anywhere. We're not going to accomplish our goals. We're not going to help pets get back home. We're not going to be able to take good care of them. So this is a part of shelter culture that really needs to change. And I am seeing it change in some places, and I sincerely hope that that trend continues. So these are some of the less talked about things in animal sheltering culture, because they are uncomfortable and embarrassing, but they're very real, and I have experienced and seen them for myself. There is an elitism with some animal shelters. You have people who think that they are better than other people. They are better than the rest of the animal owning or loving people, because they are in animal welfare, because they are spending all their time caring for animals, because they are a vegetarian or a vegan. You get a lot of that. There's an elitism that you are somehow more caring of animals than other people. There are also cliques. I see that in a lot of organizations today. The organizations that are doing very well, that are very successful, that are getting money, that are winning awards, things start getting a little cliquey. If you're on that team, you're successful. If you're not on that team, maybe you're not so successful. And then there's the good shelter, bad shelter dynamic, which you may or may not have experienced in your community. And this stems from the days when there was the Pound and the Humane Society. And it's still this way in many communities, where you have the shelter that takes in the strays and does redemptions, and then you have sort of the fancy adoption center that's the nonprofit that's usually not run by the government. And there are many, many iterations of animal shelters across the country, but that is one of the common models. Unfortunately, what you'll see in some communities is that the quote-unquote good shelter will use that old reputation to their advantage by making a big thing out of, we're taking animals from the Pound, from the shelter of the county or the city. And there's a big thing about that, where the other shelter is shown in a bad light so that the good shelter will get support. And even as times change and the shelter that acts as the Pound makes improvements, has adoptions, has staff who are really caring and trying to best to serve their community, the other shelter continues to perpetuate that old myth. And unfortunately, as I said, I have seen this happen, and it's very negative, and it's totally unnecessary. And in communities where all the different kinds of shelters work together, they are much more successful. It's a much more positive atmosphere for everyone to work and volunteer in. It provides much better customer service for the public, and ultimately everyone is more successful. Judgments and myths are also very common, and we talked a little bit about this last time. We are very quick to judge people who come in, say, because they need to relinquish a pet. Well, a lot has changed in the last 5 to 10 years, and first of all, we now have shelter intervention programs. Many shelters have a behavior counselor or someone who can help making a surrender appointment. Doing surrenders by appointment now is greatly reducing owner relinquishment, simply by talking to people and finding out what their problems are. Are they having a behavioral or medical issue with the animal that they can't handle? Are they having difficulty finding housing? In California, where I live, prices are very high right now, and there are limitations. It's very difficult for people to find housing that they can afford in the first place, let alone with pets. So we don't want to judge people. We want to see everyone equal and try to find out how we can serve them, how we can keep their pets with them. Believing in myths is also very common. Stray animals are unwanted. This is a really common one. A dog in poor condition must live in the backyard. Picture this raggy poodle here as an example of something like that. And these are things that many people still believe, and I used to believe too in the past, until now I know better, that animals who were out on their own for a while may not look that great. And if we believe that these animals were neglected, we are not going to put out the effort to find the owner, because we simply believe that they need to be adopted. So these are all attitudes that are unhealthy and just unhelpful for everyone. There is resistance to change. And change is a funny subject. There's a lot of books written on it and magazine articles, a lot of study as far as psychology. Change itself is not difficult. People say change is hard. It really isn't. Let's say you normally eat pizza and ice cream every day for lunch. Well, one day you can order a salad and eat the salad instead. That part isn't difficult. Buying a salad instead of a pizza and eating it is not difficult. It's changing your habits. It's changing what you crave, what you're used to doing, even though you know maybe it's not the best for you. And part of that resistance involves what is called cognitive dissonance. And this is some of the psychology around human behavior in animal shelters. It's very interesting when you start studying some of these behaviors that kind of don't make sense on their face, and you try to figure out why people act this way, even when it's not productive. And the dictionary definition of cognitive dissonance, as it says here, is the state of having inconsistent thoughts, beliefs, or attitudes, especially as relating to behavioral decisions and attitude change. So what cognitive dissonance basically means is that you cannot hold on to two opposing thoughts at the same time. It's either one way or the other. So think of people who are very strongly into their political beliefs around the times of elections, where people are really for one party or the other, or anything where people take sides and they can't see the view of the other side. You only see your own side. And this is also human nature, for us to just stick with one side and have a really hard time even considering the opinions of the other. And what is really frightening about this, because there's nothing wrong with having opinions or supporting a political party or having a mission or a movement. We all do these things. But what is really scary about it is, as it says here in the graphic, if you have heavily invested in a position, if this is something you believed for many years or all your life, if these are beliefs that your family holds, your friends hold, when confronted with disconfirming evidence, rather than saying, oh, tell me more, let me learn and maybe learn something new, people tend to argue and justify their position. You'll see this with religion. Maybe someone will challenge someone on their religious beliefs, and the person will argue because those are very deep-rooted beliefs. And it doesn't mean your beliefs are wrong or right. It's simply that if those are your beliefs, you have a hard time changing. So when you're in the process of learning and making improvements in the animal welfare world, we have to remember that we are all guilty of this. And we have to open our minds just for a minute, even though it can be uncomfortable, and say, okay, let me consider that other opinion. Now, one that personally happened to me was a lot of people want to talk about this early spay-neuter. They don't believe in it. They believe that pets, especially dogs, should be spayed or neutered when they're older. And the ages I've heard vary anywhere from 6 months to a year, 2 years. Well, I just soundly rejected all that. I've been in animal welfare all my life, and I didn't want to hear that. But then I realized I'm rejecting it without even reading any of the studies, without looking at any of the materials. So I'm breaking my own rule by doing this. So I did study some of the material that was promoting this point. My opinion has not changed. I still believe that early spay-neuter is safe and appropriate. But at least I educated myself. At least now when I speak of it or I make a decision, it's a more educated choice rather than simply rejecting something that I do not want to hear. So let's talk a little bit about the barriers to owner reunion. And this is something that I started working on when I was doing the seminars in the shelters, and still do, just haven't done one lately. There is an exercise that we do where we have the folks in the shelter talk about what their own barriers are. And this is something that you can all work on amongst yourselves, is identifying what your barriers are, and they are many, I guarantee you, and how you can lift them. So these are the top 5 barriers, or actually sort of groups of barriers, because there are many different ones, and it's amazing to me at each shelter I visit comes up with different barriers and different solutions. So this is why I'm not here to tell you what you should do, but to ask you to start thinking, investigating, thinking critically, and coming up with your own ideas for how things can improve. Because you can be amazed at how even small improvements will make a big change. So we're going to give one example of each of these barrier groups just to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. And you can kind of go from there and start looking around and thinking what you might do differently. So one of the barriers is inaccessibility. And you see there's the funny picture of the "don't swim in the sewage" sign. This is a real sign. We all know that shelters are not well located. I'm sure it's the same across the country. I've never been to a shelter in Canada, but I can imagine it's similar there and anywhere around the world. A lot of this has to do with zoning. It's not easy to get a permit to house large numbers of animals in the middle of town or near a residential area, and those properties also tend to be more costly. Many government agencies like the idea of co-location, so the animal shelter will be next to the jail or the fleet yard or a sewage plant or some other less desirable piece of property. And so animal control will get the other side of the property where they can set up an office and some kennels, and away they go. So this is how a lot of these facilities started. And now in the modern day, when shelters are fundraising and trying to get a new and better location to be more successful, they're finding it really difficult. Even if they have the money and the ability to build a nice new shelter, it's still difficult to get that location. So that's something that's not easy to change, but just to be aware of, that you can be hard to find. There's not going to be foot traffic if you're next to the solid waste plant. Nobody's taking a walk by there, or they're not shopping or eating nearby. So just be aware of those things in your outreach to people, because they're probably not going to know where you're located unless they've been there before, unless they're pretty savvy. Most people don't know these things. Many shelters also have limited business hours, and this may be due to staffing, or this may just be that's the way we've always done it. You see a lot of shelters not opening till 11 or 12 because cleaning is being done, and also closing quite early, closing on weekends and holidays when people are available. So these are all factors to consider. If you're expecting the owner to come down and find you, then your facility needs to be accessible, and chances are that it isn't. So due diligence is a big one, and there are some things that you can do in a shelter that are going past the extra mile, but some are simply standard procedures that really should be done. And one example of that is posting pictures of pets online. And it is shocking to me that some shelters still are not doing this, are not posting pictures, or they're not posting them right away. They're waiting a day, a few days, maybe not even until the animal goes up for adoption. And there's no reason for that. If someone is looking for their pet and they're able to search online and see the pets you have for adoption or that are there in the stray area, then that's going to encourage them to drive down, because it's not that easy for everybody. Maybe the shelter is 20 miles away from where they live. Maybe they don't have a car, so they have to arrange transportation. It's not as easy as we make it look. We believe people should just come down to the shelter every day and look, but it's really not that simple. So another problem is not adequately checking ID. Now, the ID may be checked, the animal may have a tag, you may make a phone call, and that's that. But there's often some other sleuthing you can do. Sometimes the pets come in with phone numbers that are no good. Sometimes they come in with a license tag or a rabies tag from a pet hospital. Those can require a little more sleuthing. It can be a little more challenging. The pet may come in on the weekend, the pet hospital is closed. You're going to have to call them again on Monday. It may take a while to research some older tags or older licenses. The microchips as well can be a challenge to search. You may look it up, see that it's a Home Again chip, call Home Again. Maybe it's not registered or the information is no good. Okay, well, don't stop there. See if it's registered at another registry. Find out if you have a name. I've heard of shelters even checking on Facebook to see if that name pops up. Now, obviously, if it's a super common name, that's not going to help you. But owners have been found by entering the name on Facebook and seeing enough information to see that the person lives in the area where the animal was found, and in some cases even has pictures of the animal on the Facebook page. So even if the phone number on the tag is no good or on the microchip, you may be able to send that person a message through Facebook, or you may find some other way to contact them. So there's a little deeper level of sleuthing that you can do with this ID to try and find the owner. You don't just want to do the top level thing. You want to dig down a little deeper. So a lack of outreach, and this continues to be a problem, and especially in shelters that are quite busy. And it's kind of a conundrum because if you don't get good information because you're too busy, you'll continue to have too many animals and be overcrowded, and you'll continue to be too busy. So it's sort of a self-perpetuating problem. It's like if you work too much and you don't rest or get enough sleep, you're going to be tired. But if you don't change that, you're always going to be tired. So you sort of get stuck in a loop there. Now, one of the areas where I see this the most is that folks are not getting adequate information from the finder. And when that finder is there in front of you, whether they're at the shelter or talking to an animal control officer, they have the most information about that animal at that time. And it's critical for you, whoever's handling the situation, to get that information, to find out not just where did you find the animal and get an exact location, not just a street that may be 10 miles long and you don't know exactly where it was. Try to get an address or a cross street. Ask the person, have you seen this dog out before? Half the time the person will say, yeah, it's my neighbor's dog, gets out all the time, the guy's driving me crazy. Okay, who's your neighbor? What's his address? Do you have his phone number? And very often the finder will just hand you all of this helpful information. But if you're just saying, you know, let me see your license, name, phone number, next, and then the person will just leave figuring you're going to handle it. They may not necessarily volunteer all that information, or you may not be hearing it because you're too busy entering what you need to enter in the computer. So this also becomes a problem. There are too many hands in the pot. And what I mean by that is some shelters pick up animals from different places. For example, they're allowed to be dropped off at a veterinary hospital. Now, this is understandable when they are injured, but some places even allow folks to drop off these animals as sort of a relay point. So by the time the animal gets picked up and brought to the shelter, now the finder is gone, and maybe the pet hospital didn't even get their information. So you have no information, no way of following up with the finder, and this is not an uncommon situation. So you want to be sure to get as much information as you can, and that person can help you. Some shelters will actually give the person a found report. You know, it even may just be a little piece of paper, but it's better than nothing. And tell them, please fill this out and post it where you found the animal. Please tell your neighbors, let them know, let the people know in your community that you brought this animal here so that they can find out. And if the person cares, which most people do, they will want to help, and they will do that for you. So another problem, which is pretty common, is not posting notices where pets were picked up. And this is actually a pretty uncommon practice, so it's pretty prevalent that animals are picked up all over the place, could be many miles away from the animal shelter, and the owner, they come home and their animal's gone, and they don't know what happened. Now, it may be less of an issue for dogs because people generally go looking for their dogs right away. But if a cat doesn't come home for a couple days, many people don't worry too much about it. They say, oh, he's just walking around, he's visiting other people. And so they may not have any idea that their cat has been picked up and taken to an animal shelter miles away. So there are some shelters, for example, Maricopa County in Arizona, they have little signs with wires in them, similar to the campaign signs at election time, that they can stick into the ground in any place where it's allowed. And it's a pretty basic sign, but it just has some information on where the pet was found and how the pet can be located at the shelter and the phone number of the shelter. So that kind of outreach really does work, and it's so simple, but yet so uncommonly done. Customer service is a huge one, and sometimes people just are giving poor customer service, and sometimes they're trying their best, but the agency doesn't have the bandwidth to provide the level of customer service that will make them more successful. And then don't forget about the compassion fatigue, when people just burn out from sitting there listening to people all day, yelling at them or answering the phone. And anyone who's worked in that type of situation understands what that's like. You get a little short after a while. But some of the problems that are extremely common in animal sheltering is that it's hard to get someone on the phone. And I discovered this when I was doing my study. I was just calling all the shelters in my area, and I had a heck of a time. Some shelters I called for 3-4 days, left messages. I got like some people do and just started pushing every button, trying to get any live person to leave a message. And nobody called me back. So I feel bad if I were an actual owner or maybe someone wanting to adopt or donate, I would never go down there because no one ever picked up the phone. Calls and emails may not be returned promptly. And I've worked with one shelter that was really trying to work this out, and they said they just don't have time to answer the phone. Everything goes to voicemail. And then people are too busy to pick up and return those calls promptly. So maybe once a day the calls get returned, maybe not. And that's the problem. You have to look at your systems and figure out how to fix them, but also how to have the bandwidth to handle them. Because it doesn't help to set up a voicemail so that the phone doesn't keep ringing if you're not going to check it. So somebody has to be assigned to manage all of these things. Same with emails. Some shelters have different emails for different things, adopt at, foster at, donate at, and also lost and found. But if people are going to be allowed to contact the shelter in that manner and maybe send information on a missing pet, someone needs to be on that. And depending on how your systems work and your security and whatnot at the shelter, some of these functions can be done by a volunteer. There can be someone who's simply assigned to do that task, to answer that phone or that email throughout the day while they are at the shelter to ensure that folks who need help are getting it quickly. One of the things I also see is that some agencies don't like to take reports over the phone, which I think is strange. And they'll tell people, well, you have to come down and look, and I can't identify your dog. And while those things are true, you do want to encourage people to come down. At least taking a brief report and getting the information can make all the difference in the world. And if you at least take a quick look, if you take a walk through the kennels, or if it's a giant shelter, you can't leave your seat, at least take a peek in the computer at the inventory and give them some idea. Well, there's a couple dogs here that are similar to what you're describing. I don't know, but maybe come down and look. You're looking for a blue pit bull? We have 3 of them. Come down and have a look. That will encourage people to come down. And then there's the money. So as we talked about earlier, cost recovery is really not a thing. I don't know how else to say it. Many agencies really believe in cost recovery and that they have to figure out, and I get it, that's how governments work. any form you fill out, any process you do, that fee you pay is determined to be cost recovery, and that's how it works. However, there really is no cost recovery in animal sheltering. And furthermore, why are we putting the cost recovery on the backs of those few people who actually do come down and reclaim? Where's the cost recovery for the other 80% of dogs and 98% of cats that are not found and reclaimed? Why does that one person have to pay to cover all those other animals? So obviously we need to charge fees and get revenue for the agency, but there's really no reason to rely on that as income, especially since reclaim is so poor in so many shelters. Another big expense is citations. And it's a proven fact, everyone knows, that punishment does not improve behavior. It never has, and it never will. And it certainly doesn't solve the problem if a person's animal is getting out. And as we talked about in one of our first modules about how many pets are going missing and how many are being found, that many dogs are getting out 5 to 10 times that they're getting out by the time they participated in the survey. So it's not like it just happens once. Some of these animals are a problem because their homes are not secure and all the other reasons that we talked about. So giving that person a citation isn't going to change the situation. It isn't going to motivate them to make a change. And furthermore, if they have to spend money on the citation, that's the money they could have used to fix the fence or buy a kennel. There's also missing work that we don't even think about that. But if people are missing work to come down and look at the shelter, they could potentially be losing money. And there are also transportation issues. And those of us who have cars that are new and running don't think about this, but not everybody does. Some people take public transportation. Some have vehicles that aren't too reliable or that they share with other family members. So these can all involve expenses that people really can't afford, and it can be a barrier. So that's all very negative. Let's talk about the positive steps that are being taken, because it really does make a difference. And as I always like to encourage folks, you don't have to change everything or change it 100%. But even if you do anything, if you take one step, if you try one thing, there will be an improvement. So the first thing you want to do is identify your barriers. Make a list. Figure out what is it. Do people can't get through on the phone? Are we not returning calls? Are we closed a lot, or where we're really not accessible to working people who may not be available except for evenings and weekends? What are our barriers? And be realistic about this. How can you reduce them? Pick one, pick two, and come up with some solutions. And it may be an interim solution. It may be, okay, let's have a volunteer take the calls off the voicemail and write them down. Okay, that's a solution. Just start somewhere. Proactively search for owners. Don't sit there and wait for them to come down to the shelter, because most of the time they're not going to, for all the reasons we've discussed. Come up with some procedures, whatever you can do. Tracking the ID, posting the pictures online, posting notices in the area, doing general outreach, depending on what your budget is. Maybe you can pay for marketing, maybe you can find some free marketing, or get people to donate or pay for rack cards, flyers, that sort of thing. Get the word out that your shelter is the place to go when you are looking for a missing pet. Work with those fees. For many people, $100 is the difference between whether or not they're going to buy groceries that week. Understand that. Not everyone has a lot of money and can afford to pay those reclaim fees, nor should they have to. Nor is it going to prevent their pet from getting out again. So just think about all those factors, and if the animal is getting out a lot, especially if it's a dog that's getting out of its yard, try to work with the owner to solve the problem, and not just to keep charging the money and picking up the dog, because that's not helping anybody. And if someone can't pay the fee, which sometimes they can't, they may leave and not come back. And it's not because they don't care, but it's because they don't want to be shamed for not having the money. or they just think, well, my dog will get adopted and I'll just get another one. And you want to make it a priority. And that's a very basic thing to say, but if you look at that overall, if your whole focus isn't on the adoption track, isn't on the rescuing track, if you make this a priority, if every stray pet that comes in, you say, I need to try to find the owner. If you don't, then you move down the adoption track or foster, rescue, whatever else there is to give that animal a positive outcome.